Hi everyone, and welcome to our QCE Business Units 3 and 4 lecture for today. My name is Jess, but before I tell you a little bit more about me, I'll tell you a little bit more about ATAR notes, and then we'll also get into our content for today. So for any of you who don't know about ATAR notes, we have been doing these lectures since 2015, and they're just one part of all of our offerings. We have a bunch of other resources that are available to you, as you can see here, and they're all available on our website. So if you feel like you could do with a little bit more help with any of your subjects, I would definitely recommend registering on our website and getting access to things like study notes, newsletters, articles, videos, and all of those helpful things. We also have ATAR Notes Plus, which is a newer offering that has a whole bunch of extra resources for anyone who wants even more help. And one of these things that you'll be able to get access to is our study notes. So we have a business units 3 and 4 textbook that you can access, which I actually wrote, and that covers everything in the syllabus that you need to know and provides some tips and some examples that will help you as well. So let's get stuck into a little bit about me, and then we'll have a look at our lecture schedule for today. So as I mentioned, my name's Jess. I graduated in 2020, and I'm studying communication and journalism at the University of Queensland. I got a business score in year 12 of 95, and I love reading and writing. So all of the humanities subjects were my favorites, including business and English as well. Okay, so in terms of what we're covering today, we are up to looking at everything that you need to know for your external exam. So in business, your external exam is going to be on Unit 4, Topic 2, which is all about change management. So today we'll go over all of the background concepts that you need to know with change management, drivers of change, and all of the things that are involved in those concepts. And we'll also be looking at the models that you need to know. These are likely things that will be new for you. So Lewin's change model and Cotter's 8-step model. Analysis tools. So some of these you will have done across your business studies at school. So your SWOT analysis is one of those, whereas you may not be familiar with the force field analysis, and you may or may not know the power interest grid. We'll look at the evaluation criteria that you will have been using throughout your business studies, and we'll finish with some tips and a summary of what we've learnt today. So in this lecture, we'll be covering all of the content that you need to know. And if you come back for our September exam revision lecture series, then you'll be able to get a refresher of this content. And we'll also go over things like practice questions and example answers, so you know exactly where you're headed with your preparation for the external exam. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so what is change management? So change management is a process. That word is really important here. So the process of managing a business's transition from its current state to a desired future state. It is a pretty broad expression as well, but it's all about being strategic and structured. So a strategic and structured approach that is all about enhancing a company's performance and making it more competitive in the market. So it's identifying where you want to be and how you're going to get there. So there's a whole bunch of different things that businesses face in terms of change. So the expectations and the demands of consumers are constantly changing as our society changes. So things like consumer tastes, we are increasingly concerned with things like supporting local suppliers, buying Australian as well, or buying in our local community. There's a shift towards sustainability. We want to look after the environment more and make sure that we're treating people and all of the people and things that are involved in the production process well. And also things like vegan and vegetarian products are also things that have developed in terms of consumer tastes over time. And these are all things that businesses need to factor in to their decision making and potentially make some adjustments for. There's some other examples here as well. So, in the market or products that are sold, so the way that things are sold, for example, online shopping has obviously grown over the years. We've got the sort of society that we live in, the sort of throwaway society or the need it now society, can impact the way that a business operates and how employees perform their jobs. We've got things like the self-serve checkouts in supermarkets. In some supermarkets now, there are a whole bunch of self-serve checkouts and virtually no traditional checkouts. And again, sustainability and things like that as well. And lastly, the way that things are produced because of technology and automation, those things have changed a lot and businesses have needed to change accordingly. So, of course, we've got artificial intelligence is a big thing now. Other things that are sort of still developing or we might see more in the future, things like drone deliveries, driverless vehicles, we've got things like electric cars and Uber and those sorts of things as well. And businesses need to think about how those trends are going to impact their operations. So, for example, if you've got a restaurant, then maybe they need to think about having vegan and vegetarian products on their menu and supporting local suppliers. They may need to allow people to order their meal online and potentially get it delivered via Uber Eats or an equivalent of that. So you can see how all of these different things can come together to have a big impact on the way a business operates. So, as part of this unit, you need to be able to describe business facts and characteristics relating to business renewal. And that's going to include the internal, operating, and macro environmental factors that influence the need for change. So, we can see in this diagram here that we've got those three levels. The internal is encompassing our owners and managers, employees, organizational structure, and organizational culture. And we'll have a look at some examples of these things as well. We've also got operating, and this is the next layer out, customers, competitors, suppliers, and interest groups. And the biggest level, the macro level, is where we've got the steeple analysis kind of acronym is handy to remember this. So sociocultural, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical. That's the steeple there. So you may see this as kind of like if you think of the business as being a house. Inside the house, you've got the people and the structures that make it tick. So the employees, the owners, the actual structure of the organization, and the culture of the organization are all inside that building. The operating is sort of a mesh between the outside and the inside. Um, it's kind of the walls of the business. You've got customers, competitors, and suppliers that are all coming from the outside, but they are in the fabric of the way that the business operates. Then we've got the broader business environment as well. So all of the things that happen in society and those things that impact the business on those broader levels. So let's have a look at all of these different things and some examples to help us get our heads around this. So in your exam and as well at school when you're practicing these skills, you'll likely be looking at business case studies and their situations, perhaps getting some stimulus, and then needing to figure out how you can describe the way that the business has been impacted by whatever factors are relevant in that case, and why that has influenced the need for change in that business. So, an example that you've likely come across before is the Dreamworld example. So, the internal environmental factor influencing the need for change for Dreamworld was employees. So, they had the Thunder River Rapids ride accident back in 2016. And so this resulted in employees putting some pressure on the organization to provide some more training around safety and things like that to prevent those sorts of incidents happening again, because the employees felt they needed to have better training so they could operate the rides safely. So those sorts of things are internal pushes that are going to make a business change the way that it operates. Of course, in this case, like in many cases, you're going to have more than just one. So while employees did push for change in this case, you've also got other sort of stakeholders who would have pushed for change here as well. So interest groups in terms of um, all of the different investors in Dreamworld, authorities, and sort of the legal system as well. You've got that macro aspect where you had the legalities involved in having this accident and making sure that it wouldn't happen again. So, as we'll see in these other examples we'll look at, it's usually more than just one that you can identify for each example. And sometimes that is a skill as well. Sometimes you'll be asked to describe business factors and characteristics relating to one of these three different levels, and you'll need to think about what is the main thing that you need to describe. Another example is Coca-Cola. So in this case, we're looking at the operating level and its customers. So influencing the need for change was customers because their tastes were changing and they were increasingly interested in healthier eating and being more conscious of sugar intake and things like that. So consumers are also more aware of their environmental footprint, and this is where we can see that it's not just the operating level here; it's also the macro level with that macro environmental factor. And so here, Coca Cola had to make several changes, and some of those were around the products that it was going to offer in terms of making sure it was catering to those tastes and also the dietary kind of considerations. Things like sugar taxes as well. So government and political kind of decision making would have played in here as well on that macro level, and then the environmental footprint as well. So, for example, in this case, one of the changes that Coca Cola made was making its packaging fully recyclable, to cater to those environmental kind of pushes in the market. Another example for operating is Eastbridge. So this is a retailer selling clothes, and it used to be in Australia with different outlets, but the factor that needed to change that was competitors. So it was struggling financially in the competitive retail industry in Australia. So it decided to implement change to try and counteract its falling revenues. And it wanted to focus its resources in the Asian market. So it would have been some research in that area to identify the market that it was best to target, and the Asian market was what it identified as being the best option there. So that's competitors that can drive an organization out of a certain market. And then usually there are other factors that are going to be involved in that as well. So economic factors, sociocultural factors, and those sorts of things that impact what is popular in certain markets and where it is best for businesses to focus their attention. And another example, this one is macro. We've got the environmental factor here. So in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, Lego changed its materials to make sure it was using products that are made from renewable or recyclable materials. So the same idea as Coca-Cola before, those changing values in society. So that's a socio-cultural kind of aspect coming in as well, and the environmental values as well. Um, so they changed their packaging, and it's now made from sustainable materials that can easily be recycled. There are lots of possible impacts of change. So we've just looked at a few there. It can be changing packaging, it can be moving out of a market entirely, implementing new training for employees. It all depends on the certain business scenario that you're looking at. But we do have a bunch of examples here for different sort of levels. We've got the internal and the external. Management and employees are on the inside, and externally, we've got customers and suppliers. And there are other categories that you can look at here as well. So, in the management section, a possible impact of change is perhaps needing a new management style entirely. So, if the management style is not effective, then maybe they need to be more participative with employees, involving them in decision making, for example. We'll have a look at the different management styles shortly and the sort of ins and outs of each of those. You may also need to train management for a new system. You may need to appoint new management. Perhaps the existing management is not effective, and it's not just about changing the style, but changing the people and their way of operating entirely. You may change the hierarchy structure, so the organizational structure that we saw in the diagram in the internal section. You could also have a merging or an amalgamation of different departments. So new departments could also be made, or departments could be joined together to perhaps save resources, for example. In terms of employees, you may have new roles and new sort of descriptions for jobs. You may need greater skills and more training, and you may have a restructuring of the different roles in the organization. In terms of customers, you may need to cater to different customers to make sure that they're aware of changes that you've made by introducing advertising and marketing campaigns. You may need to target new customers, perhaps if a business is shifting its focus, if it wants to perhaps be more sustainable. Maybe it wants to target new customers that value that sustainability. If you could have the business needing to reestablish existing customers, so maybe it has needed to change because of struggling for some reason. Maybe there's been some controversy. Maybe the business has done the wrong thing. and it needs to get customers back on side. So incentives and rewards, and again those marketing campaigns to get the word out about how it's changing would be necessary there. Investigating new competitors and their customers could be necessary as well. So if the business is moving into a whole new sort of sector, maybe it's offering a new product, taking advantage of new technologies and things like that, it perhaps is going to have new competitors in those new spaces, and it will need to make sure it's monitoring those, just like any business needs to monitor its competitors. And in terms of suppliers, it may need to renegotiate existing contracts with suppliers to match whatever the change is. You may need to source new suppliers from local, national, or international areas. If you're expanding overseas, then that would perhaps mean that international suppliers would be necessary to save on costs. If you continue to source from one country, even though you've moved into another, then you're going to have to fort the cost of getting all of your products over to that other country. And then outsourcing as well in terms of production, and that's going to result in changes to the supply chain too. So we've got a whole bunch of drivers of change. Those were some of the impacts of change. Drivers of change are what is pushing the change to happen. What could be happening in the environment that is resulting in that change being necessary. So one of these is corporate culture. And this is all about the values and the beliefs that are embedded in the business and, of course, its employees as well. So, this is one of the aspects that's the internal kind of thing, the organizational culture or corporate culture. They are the same kind of concept. So, your corporate culture is going to distinguish you from other competitors. So, businesses may offer the same products or the same services, but what should usually be different is the way that that business is in terms of its culture inside. And that can help customers decide what business they would actually go for. If it's offering the same kind of products at the same sort of prices, then um, customers have little else to sort of distinguish those businesses aside from the sort of values and beliefs that that business has and the way that it operates based on those. So business leaders are responsible for building corporate culture, so they need to implement different different reward schemes, procedures, and things like that that are going to reflect the employees in the business and the strategic plan for the way that that business operates and the where it's headed as well. So an example is Microsoft. You've got lots of those big tech companies that you may have heard of having lots of really amazing sort of cultures in terms of the reward schemes that are available and things like that. So Microsoft is one example. Um, their corporate culture is said to be inclusive, innovative, diverse, and accountable. Diversity is something that's really important these days. We want to have a whole bunch of different people who are reflecting our broader society, and we want to be inclusive of everyone. So that's something that you'll see a lot of when it comes to corporate culture now. Um, and innovation, of course, especially in the tech space, is really important when you're looking at developing technologies and thinking about the future and how to innovate to improve the future. So Microsoft helps to get all of that innovation and foster that innovation by rewarding employees for ideas that are going to contribute to the company's success. And so, according to Comparably, it had the best global corporate culture in 2022. Another driver of change is management styles. So, I mentioned earlier that we were going to look at the different types, and we've got them on screen now. There are four main management styles. But first, what is a management style? So, it is a driving force of change because the approach that management is taking in terms of how it's managing the business and the employees is going to influence the business's outcomes. So you need to really effectively manage change to make sure that the customers are happy, the employees are happy, and any other stakeholders like investors and suppliers and things like that are also happy and are aware of what's happening as well. So, management has to instigate the change, motivate stakeholders, communicate clearly, and manage any employees who are resistant to the change. And we'll look more at resistance to change shortly. That can be something that is really tricky because you can definitely have employees who don't want to see something change, who don't want um, to shift according to the the way that the market is heading. Um, and we'll have a look at some of those shortly. So the four main management styles that you need to know are autocratic, which is where the management is maintaining full power over the control. Persuasive, so this is where management is still maintaining power over the change, but they are doing this persuasive kind of process to get co-workers to support the change. Consultative is where we've got management working with stakeholders. So stakeholders are somewhat engaged in the change. They get a voice in the change, but ultimately it's still going to be the management that makes the decision. So these words are all sort of words that you're probably familiar with. That idea of persuasion. You're not actually giving very much. You're not giving people a say or a voice. You're simply trying to get across your ideas to persuade them that you are right. Um, Consulting is actually actively talking with people and listening to them, but ultimately still having control over the way that that change is implemented. And then lastly, we've got participative. So managers and employees are collectively making decisions about the change. All stakeholders are involved, and it's a really integrated kind of system. So we go from one extreme to the other with those four management styles. Some examples of management styles. So big companies are often going to need to use an autocratic style because ultimately it's not really possible to have base level employees being involved in the change. When you've got thousands of employees spread across the globe, that would logistically be really challenging. So even if the business wants to be more consultative or participative, that may not really be possible. So McDonald's is an example of that. It has an autocratic management style because crew members are not involved in decision making. And so this helps McDonald's to streamline those processes. And maybe some crew members get some say in things on a more micro level. But in terms of crew members meeting with the CEO, meeting with executives to get a say on big decisions, that is probably not going to be the case. Another example is Boost Juice, and so they have a more consultative approach because the business is actively asking for staff input. So they've got monthly meetings, and managers encourage all staff members to contribute to those team discussions. and get across their ideas and their views, and that's all about consulting with those employees, where Boost Juice is still going to make the ultimate decisions, but people get a say and might have an influence on those decisions. So the idea of management can be pretty complex, and when you've got change, as I mentioned, some people are not going to be supportive of that. So there are some important management style elements to try and facilitate change. You need to be a good communicator, so having a clear direction and a vision for the change, and then getting that across to all of the people who care, or have power in some way. Um, Liaising with different people. So you need to be able to manage and consult with people during the change. Advocate. So showing why the change is necessary, um, and and being, I guess, persuasive in that way. Coaching. So engaging and motivating stakeholders through the change. Um, And part of that as well is being just a good resistance manager. You need to be able to identify when there is resistance to change and then implement different strategies to try and get employees past the line and make them satisfied with where the business is headed. And shortly, we will also have a look at some strategies for managing resistance to change. So another driver of change is organizational structure. So we've looked at culture, and now we're also looking at the way that that business is actually structured internally with all of the positions. So this is all about the duties of employees and the management hierarchy within the business. And so you could have lots of different changes in organizational structure. You may have um, the different structure of employee positions, a different chain of command with who is whose boss, and where the decisions are getting made by who, and then also the management framework as well. So perhaps sometimes you have one manager who's managing everything, and a change might be that you have two different managers who are on the same level, and have the same power in that organization. So these changes for structure within a business could be necessary for lots of reasons. So if the business is expanding, then you're likely going to need more people to help manage that overseas expansion. And equally, when a business is downsizing, perhaps you need uh, less management, fewer employees looking after the business. If you're merging with another company or acquiring another company, then those will also have an impact on the way that the business is going to have its structure internally. So, an example that I always think of when I'm thinking of organizational structure that I found really helpful at school, as an immediate kind of vision in my head, is just your high school kind of structure in terms of the way that you've got the chain of command and the hierarchy with all of the teachers and the executive level kind of staff members. So often we're going to have a principal at the top, and then we'll have deputy principals. Sometimes you may have many deputy principals who are in charge of different areas. Sometimes you may only have one or two. So in this example here, we've got a senior school deputy and a junior school deputy. That might be one way that a school is arranged in terms of structure. These things will depend on the size of the school, whether it's a state school or a private school, because that will influence um, how it's arranged in terms of funding and things like that to pay the different staff members. And then underneath those deputy principals, you may have the head of departments for different areas. So English and maths and humanities. And again, different schools will be arranged in different ways. So in some schools, you may have just one head of humanities if it's a smaller school. If it's a larger school, maybe you need more people to look after that area because there's lots of subjects within humanities. So instead of having one broader teacher who's in charge of that, you may have a head of accounting, a head of legal studies, a head of history, etc., etc. And then beneath that, in your hierarchy, you may have teachers who aren't head of departments, but just take regular classes, and that is their role in school. So that organizational structure will change a lot depending on the school and its size and all of those factors. And it's the same thing when it comes to a business as well. So that's a great point of reference to help you remember what organizational structures involve. So let's take a look at some business examples now. So Toyota, back in April 2022, implemented changes to its executive structure. In this case, it reorganized its operating officer roles, and it also established a whole new role, the executive vice president position. So that would have resulted in some shifts in the way that hierarchy would have looked in that business. And then Telstra, also in 2022, announced that it had moved all of its consumer and small business call centers to Australia. And to do this, it had to hire 2,000 more staff members who mostly work remotely in Australia. So that would have been a huge shift in its organizational structure. Instead of outsourcing to overseas call centers, it was basing everything here, and there would have been a lot of logistical things to figure out there to make that change happen. Competition is another driver of change. So businesses need to monitor strengths and weaknesses in terms of their competitors and shifts in the business environment and all of the evolving customer needs that we've spoken a little bit about already. And then the business needs to continually adapt to those things as well. So it's definitely important to do the monitoring so you're aware of what's happening in the market, what competitors you have, and how what strategies you can implement to stay up to date with them. Then it's also important that the business is going to adapt to make sure it stays on par and even ahead of competitors as well. So competition can be a particular driver of change in lots of different instances. So particularly when competitors are going to change their pricing, perhaps use different advertising strategies or marketing strategies, introduce new products or services as well, and use new technology. So if businesses are doing those things, then their competitors are going to need to think about how that's um, going to change the overall market. If one business is reducing their pricing, then other businesses may need to follow in order to stay competitive and continue to attract their customers. And it can also be a driver of change just when new competitors come into a market as well. So, back a number of years ago now, we had other supermarkets from overseas wanting to come into Australia. So in Australia, we've of course got Woolies and Coles, as well as organisations like Aldi, and we had I believe it was a German organisation that wanted to come into Australia, but we have a really saturated market, so that didn't end up happening. But it would have been the case that uh, Woolies and Coles and those existing competitors would have been monitoring the possibility that they would need to compete with a new rival in the market. So some more examples of competition. I mentioned that technology and rivals implementing new technologies can be a driver of change. And this is what we can see here with KFC. So KFC recognized a drive-through only trend in the very competitive fast food industry. So it opened its first drive-through only store in Newcastle back in 2019. And we can see a little image there of what that looked like. And this involved using new technology. Of course, if you're going to only have drive through, then you will have a bunch of things technology wise to make that happen, because you're far more reliant on um, having that technology to take people's orders and to make sure it's efficient and it's not going to get orders wrong and things like that. Another example is Woolworths. So again, the competitive supermarket industry. Back in 2018, Coles launched its Little Shop Collectibles, which you can see on the screen there. And Woolworths actually lost quite a lot of business as a result of that because it didn't implement straight away its own sort of take on this collectibles trend. So, to remain competitive, Woolworths did end up launching its own collectibles. And since then, both businesses have had lots of different iterations of different collectibles. And of course, that isn't necessarily always straightforward. So, yes, Woolworths did lose customers and did respond by following what Coles was doing. However, then both organizations were also criticized by some people who didn't think that the collectibles were a sustainable strategy and were concerned with sort of increases in plastic and waste and stuff like that, because lots of kids were wanting to collect these little things, and then eventually they were just going to be thrown away and contribute to the environmental problems that we have in today's society. So every different strategy has its pros and cons most of the time. Next up, our next driver of change is legislative compliance. So this one is pretty self-explanatory. When you have federal, state, or local changes in terms of legislation and laws, then businesses need to make sure they're changing accordingly. And if a business doesn't comply with those new laws, then of course you can have fines and a whole bunch of other consequences. So, new laws can also compel businesses to make sure they're altering their practices to comply. Um, Laws, policies, regulations, rules, and standards are all words that we can use in this instance to describe things that businesses need to stay on top of. Um, and so one example we've got here is privacy laws. So many of us have likely heard about the Optus data breach that happened in 2022. The government, as a result of that, amended the Telecommunications Regulations 2021 legislation. And this meant that Optus could only share limited information with certain organizations, so financial institutions and government agencies. And this was designed to help to detect and mitigate the risks of malicious activity, so ID thefts and scams and things like that. They were aiming to try and reduce the chance of Optus customers being affected any further by data breaches. So some things can be temporary changes like this one, and some things can be long-lasting, permanent kind of shifts in terms of the laws that businesses have to follow. So another example is the plastic bag laws. So back in 2018, retailers had to stop supplying customers with single-use plastic bags. Um, so in places like Woolworths and Coles, we used to have plastic bags at the checkouts, and if you were getting your bags packed at a checkout, then you would get a plastic bag or lots of plastic bags with all of your purchases in there. And these days, you have to supply your own, so you can buy reusable ones, or you or you can buy the plastic versions that are made from recycled plastic. Um, so retailers face fines if they don't comply with these new laws, and also if they provide any misleading information about plastic bags. So we can see in this image here, made from at least 80% recycled plastic is what's on that bag there. And so, for example, if that was incorrect, if that was misleading consumers to believe something that isn't true, then the the supermarket would face fines or some kind of other consequence for that marketing, that sort of false marketing. Another example is minimum wage laws. This one's a little bit different in that it can change all the time. So each time we have federal budgets or different changes like that, changes in the economy, um, we often see little alterations to minimum wage laws to try and stay up with what's happening in the financial world. So in July 2022, the national minimum wage increased by 5.2%, and that was the equivalent of $40 per week. And so businesses had to adjust to make sure that they were complying with that. And that can have lots of different flow ons. It's not necessarily just a straightforward thing all the time when it comes to legislative compliance, because some businesses may just not have the means to comply with laws. And that means that, for example, in this case, they may need to reduce their staff numbers because they can't sustain the new level of pay for the number of employees that they have. Another example is tobacco advertising laws. So, Australia has laws around the advertising and packaging of tobacco products. And this is all aimed around trying to discourage people from smoking. And so, tobacco businesses can't use logos, brand images, or any promotional text on the packaging. And instead, packaging has to display health warnings and images that are going to display what the health impacts could look like. Another thing that you need to know is your force field analysis. So we'll have a look more at this later and see an example when we get to our analysis tools section. But for now, or when we get to our models section, in fact, but you also need to be able to just explain this as well. So not only being able to do it, but just explain the idea behind it and the process as well. So Kurt Lewin's force field analysis is all about identifying and examining the driving forces, which we've just looked at, and the restraining forces for the implementation of a suggested change. So, what is supporting that change or prompting that change to happen? Those are the driving forces. And what is restraining the change from happening or obstructing it or making it more difficult in some way? Those are the restraining forces. So we've looked at driving forces, legislative compliance, competition, things like that. And there are lots of different restraining forces as well. So it could be things like not having the finances to make that change, having different different restrictions around lots of different resourcing restrictions with employees, with the skills that the employees have, um, and things like that. So to conduct a force field analysis, you need to, first of all, identify what those driving and restraining forces are. And then it's about assigning a score that's going to represent the level of influence of each of those forces. So 1 is the least influential and 5 is the most influential. So a score from 1 and 5 representing how influential that force is. And then based on those scores, you're going to get a tally and you're going to determine whether the driving or restraining forces are stronger. And from there, that's where you make some decisions and make some plans for where you're headed. So you can develop a strategy to try and successfully implement the change, and that's going to involve either strengthening the driving forces or weakening the restraining forces, or perhaps a little bit of both as well. Alternatively, you may notice based on this analysis that the change is really not feasible. Maybe the restraining forces are far outweighing the driving forces according to the force field analysis that you've done. And that's going to help you understand that the change is not going to be something that can be implemented right now. Perhaps that's going to show that it shouldn't be pursued now, but you should revisit it in future. Or perhaps it will show that the change really isn't ever going to be feasible. Another aspect that you need to know about is performance management. So, performance management is like change management, a process. So, management is going to review the overall performance of the business and its employees as well. And that's going to help it determine how goals can be better reached, how the performance of the business and the employees can be improved to achieve those goals. So, performance management can identify strategies to enhance employees' performance, and it can also improve overall productivity in the business by reviewing the processes that the business uses and perhaps identifying ways that those could be changed, maybe through automation, through technology, through changing the organizational structure, streamlining things in that way. So, all of those things that we've looked at earlier with those different factors that could be drivers of change, they could be relevant here when you're looking at performance management as well. So, an example is Google. So, Google introduced a new rating system for employees in 2022 and streamlined its evaluation process as well. So, like most businesses, you're going to have some kind of process where your business is going to look at the way that employees are performing to make sure that they're delivering the best services or creating the best products. and Google was changing its rating system and its evaluation system. So performance ratings were going to then happen once per year, and promotions would happen twice per year according to that change. So performance management is a continuous process. Like you can see in the diagram on screen there, we've got 4 continuous stages and it just goes round and round. So you start by setting objectives and then you're measuring your performance against those objectives. Then it's about providing feedback to employees. So you've measured how well employees and the overall business is performing, and then you can provide all of the relevant people with feedback to try and improve that. And then identifying needs as well. So um, once you've got that feedback, once you understand how the business is performing, you need to think about how the business can act on those findings and how it can change to improve. And then, of course, you just go full circle and you get back to setting objectives. You now understand what your performance was like and how it compared to your original objectives. You've given feedback to employees, you've come up with some strategies and identified the requirements that will help you improve, and then you can reset new objectives that reflect that whole process and what you found as a result of that. So, another example is Amazon. So, Amazon has a bit more of a controversial kind of reputation when it comes to performance management. So they are said to have rubrics to determine how well employees fulfill their roles, and how much potential they have compared to other employees. So in this case, it's kind of a competitive approach within the organization. So employees are compared to one another as a way of sort of incentivizing each employee to try and do their best, so as not to lose their job as a result of not performing as well as others, for example. So, key performance indicators or KPIs are something that you may have heard of before, and this is something that's part of performance management as well. So, these provide a way for businesses to measure progress towards a goal that they've set. So, this whole process will involve strategizing. What does the business want to achieve? How is the business going to achieve it? That's about measuring and then evaluating, did we achieve that goal? What else can we do in future? How can we improve? All of those different questions and considerations. So using KPIs during business transformation can be really helpful for a lot of different reasons. So it can motivate employees to perform. You've got a key performance indicator that they are trying to work towards meeting. It can also just guide employees towards achieving the goal. So, not only about motivation, but also just giving employees a direction. They know what the broader organization is hoping for, and they can work towards that. And then also alerting management to the risk of resistance as well. Um, that is something that will come through if different employees don't strive to meet KPIs, then that is perhaps going to be a bit of a signal that they aren't aligned with the overall direction that the business is heading. So let's have a look now at an example of a KPI. So this is an older example from Maya from a number of years ago, but it still shows us an example and how you can track your performance and what kind of impacts KPIs and how they are achieved. So for Maya, their KPI in this case was um, reducing the packaging items in the litter stream. So this is sort of reflecting that move towards sustainability. We've got a target here. What were your annual targets for the reporting period? We can see that they wanted to look for opportunities to minimize the likelihood of consumer packaging becoming litter. And so they were specifically looking at carry bags, receipts and dockets, brochures, catalogs, and other sort of marketing materials. And then once you've set your goal, you also need to measure that to see whether you achieved it. In this case, Maya was said to achieve this KPI, but the limitation that they recorded here was there were no new litter risks identified as a priority for action in that financial year. So they're saying there um, that they achieved their goal and there were no new things that came up that they needed to factor into that KPI. So some effects on the KPI performance. We've got hanger reuse and recycle program. So here they're talking about how they are collecting hangers for reuse and recycling, how they are also collecting damaged hangers and grinding them and mixing them with other materials to create new hangers. So instead of just those hangers going to landfill, it's more of a circular process. We've also got some messages to customers. So the communication and the marketing aspects are important too to achieve goals because in this case, consumers play a big role since they're the ones receiving the dockets and the brochures, and they are deciding what they do with those items, whether they put them in recycle bins or whether they just put them into bins that will head to landfill. So Maya implemented some messaging that was encouraging customers to consider the environment before disposing of the waste. So, performance management can result in several different outcomes for the business. Today, we're going to look at three. So, one of them that you've probably heard of before is redundancy. So, an employee's position is no longer needed, so the business dismisses that employee. That is what redundancy is about. So, it's not being fired because when you're fired, it's about doing something wrong. It's about breaking some kind of code of conduct or law that's resulting in that loss of employment. Redundancy is just about that position that the employee held isn't actually needed anymore. It can't be sustained anymore. So the business needs to let go of that employee or employees. Often it's just more than one in lots of cases for bigger organizations. So the employer is obligated to pay the employee to compensate for their job loss because that employee needs to then go out and find another job. And so they're compensated for that sudden loss of their employment. So, for example, in during COVID-19, we had lots of examples of organizations that reduced staff members and made them redundant. Organizations were trying to streamline processes, save on money, and that resulted in redundancies. So, an example is the NRL, the National Rugby League. So they went from having um, two referees to one referee for each game. They had reductions in terms of the number of people who would go out and work with school kids to develop them and do training sessions and things like that. So there were a number of redundancies there. So redundancy can occur for lots of different reasons. COVID was one example, but you can also have technological changes. So if you've got automation or technology that can take over and do the work of people, then people may not be needed anymore. If a business restructures, merges with another organization, or acquires or is acquired by another organization, those will all have an impact and potentially result in redundancies. And also just a business downturn. If a business is struggling, then they may not be able to continue to employ people and pay their salaries or wages. So that will also result in potential redundancies. So how to handle a redundancy? Uh, it's really important that management, again, is responsible here. They need to plan and implement the process really well. It shouldn't just be a really quick kind of decision that doesn't have a great deal of thought behind it, because in order to make it an effective process, you have to avoid trauma to the staff that are still in the organization. You have to communicate openly and clearly to make sure everyone's on the same page, to avoid sort of rumors and misinformation from spreading about the reasoning behind the redundancies and things like that. You also have to just treat redundant employees with respect and dignity. It can be really tricky when you lose a job, um, and so that needs to be handled really well to make sure those staff members are looked after. So another outcome that could result from business transformation um, and performance management is retraining. So, when employees are taught more about the activities they need to perform as part of their job, that is retraining. So, this could also mean uh, entirely new skills are necessary, or it could be that they just need more training on the existing things that they're already doing. So, that's going to depend on the business and what's happening in the market. So, an example is if you've got a supermarket and you've got employees who work at the checkout, and perhaps a that business is going to bring in a new sort of offering with a cafe as part of the supermarket, then you may need to retrain employees so they can uh, do the barista work that's required, for example. Um, Also, if you've got different technologies that are coming in, then employees will need to know about those technologies and how to work with them as well. So, there are different benefits and different disadvantages for both employees and businesses as well. So, let's have a look at what we've got here. So, some benefits to employees. Obviously, you've got updated skills and you've got continuous learning for employees, which is always good. Um, the employee's skill set is developed, and that can improve workplace outcomes and the motivation that employees feel. If the business is showing that it's investing in employees and wanting to help them thrive in their roles, then that can result in a better organizational culture and relationship between management and all the employees who are working in that organization. Then some benefits to business. We've got increasing productivity, and then that can also have flow-ons with increasing the products and the services provided, the sort of value and the efficiency and the effectiveness of those products and services, and then that can result, of course, in more income. And then having more highly skilled employees can just increase efficiencies and, of course, the bottom line in terms of increasing the revenue. There are some disadvantages as well. So you could have resistance to change here as well. Employees may not want to participate in retraining programs for whatever reason. Maybe they uh, really like the traditional way of performing their role and they're not interested in a new technology that the business wants to implement. Um, Retraining may also require employees to work longer hours to do that upskilling, and so that can have an impact on their work-life balance, and they may not be available, all those sorts of logistical considerations. And then, of course, disadvantages to businesses. Retraining can be expensive and it may not always result in what the business wanted to achieve. So, if a business does internal retraining, then it's putting its own resources, its own time of high level employees to manage that retraining. If it's outsourced, then of course the business is going to have to pay for that outsourcing. So regardless of what strategy the business uses, it will be putting resources towards that retraining, and they would definitely want to get a result, positive result from that to get a bit of a return on investment. Retraining can also hinder a workplace from recruiting new people. So if you've just done all of this new training for employees, and then you are needing to hire new people who don't have that training, that can be really tricky. You've just invested in all of this training for existing employees, and then you wanting to hire, and every candidate that has applied for the position doesn't already have that training. So that can mean that you've got growth perhaps from training people, increased productivity, and increased profits as well. Maybe you then need to expand because you're having greater success. But then, in order to expand, you want more people, but those people are not trained. So you've got this idea that you can have positive impacts, but then those positive impacts can be hindered by those negatives as well. So our third and final one in terms of the results of performance management in this case is development. So it can be tricky to understand the difference between retraining and development. This is something that we usually hear as just one single unit, retraining and development as one thing. But in terms of development, it's more of a one-on-one thing with each employee. So each employee is establishing a plan with their employer that's going to allow them to develop in their career and improve their ability to perform in their role in the business. So developing in terms of career and the different tools that people need to advance in their career. Whereas retraining is about skills and it's usually a broader thing, talking about all employees or a whole series of employees getting new training to learn new skills for their roles. So, I mentioned earlier that we were going to look at some strategies for overcoming resistance to change. So, this is where we're up to now. And these different strategies we're looking at are categorized according to their level of risk as well. Some are low risk and some are high risk. Our first one, communication, is low risk. Of course, every strategy really for overcoming any kind of resistance is going to need a really good level of communication. So you need to be honest, transparent, effective in your communication throughout the transformation phase. And that's going to ensure that stakeholders are supportive of the change and they're motivated to help the organization implement that change. And some examples of communication mediums that you can use, just all the regular ones. So emails, reports, in-person conversations, formal or informal meetings. So bringing people together to talk about how they feel about the change, and to try and work with them to get them to understand what the change is. So we can see in this diagram here, we've got the communication continuum strategy, that a business can use. So getting people aware of what the change is and why it's necessary, that can lead to understanding. And once employees understand the reasoning and that justification behind a change, hopefully they are going to then align themselves with that way of thinking and that direction that the business wants to go in. Once they're aligned, they're going to accept that, and then they're going to be committed to it and to helping the business achieve what it wants to achieve. Another low risk strategy is participation. So, encouraging engagement from employees in the change process is going to make them feel like they have more control. And often having control is something that makes people feel a little bit happier about a change happening. Um, and it can also then enhance the business's corporate culture. So we spoke earlier about management styles. One of them was participative, and that was all about giving people a voice, working with them to think about how to implement changes and strategies and stuff like that. So it's the same idea with overcoming resistance to change, giving people that voice and that control, showing that you care about their thinking, and want to work with them, are all things that are usually going to be well received by employees. So, involving employees can act as a motivational tool, make them feel appreciated and listened to, and all of that is going to usually positively impact the whole resistance to change, and transform that into acceptance, like we saw in that communication continuum strategy. Next, we've got negotiation. This is also a low risk strategy, but we're sort of progressing a little bit towards a slightly higher level of risk here. So negotiation is often required when change occurs, because when you are communicating with people, when you are getting employees to participate in discussions, participate in decision making, just the communication alone is usually not going to result in everyone being satisfied. So hopefully it's going to go a long way to getting people to understand, if they know, like I mentioned, the reasoning and how it would work and those sorts of things. That's a great start, but they may want to negotiate um, to make it a little bit more aligned with what they think is best. So this negotiation process could involve employers or leaders in an organization identifying any employees who are likely to resist change, or who have expressed their sort of resistance to change outright. And then those employers or leaders will try and negotiate with them to get them to cooperate, to get them to be satisfied. Negotiation is all about this sort of bargaining process, this back and forward, where you're not arguing, but you're communicating respectively with one another, and usually finding some kind of middle ground or compromise that everyone is happy with. So it can be a relatively straightforward strategy to avoid significant resistance. Usually when both the organization and the employee is giving a little and taking a little, you're finding this middle ground, and that's something that most people are happy with. However, it can also be expensive. So depending on what you are doing in this strategy, you may be paying for different incentives. You may be taking a different route that is more expensive for the business to implement. Um, Maybe you're implementing some kind of change and employees are not happy with that because of potential sustainability kind of impacts, environmental impacts. Maybe the result of the negotiation is uh, a compromise that involves the employer looking at a more sustainable option, but that sustainable option may cost more money. And also negotiation can just result in incentives um, and rewards that are used to try and get employees on side. And so make sure you don't get confused between negotiation and manipulation. So this is where we're getting into the high risk level of strategies for overcoming resistance to change. So manipulation aims to achieve the result that the business is looking for by really strategically dealing with or exercising influence over an employee. So this again can be a quick strategy, but it can also be expensive depending on what strategies are used. It can also cause more damage to a business's corporate culture. So if employees realize that they're being manipulated or suspect they're being manipulated, then they might not receive that particularly well. So some examples, perhaps offering an incentive to a change resistant staff member, like a promotion or another reward to get their support, or managers communicating the advantages of a change, but sort of strategically not mentioning some disadvantage. That can be manipulation as well, because you're misleading them, you're not giving them the full picture of the change and what it would involve. Lastly, we have threat. So this is the highest risk strategy for overcoming resistance. So this is about intimidation, intimidating employees with punishments and consequences that could be implemented if they don't comply with the change and support it. So you could demote employees or dismiss them entirely. Um, so if they want to avoid those sorts of consequences, then employees are going to be sort of forced into accepting the change. Again, it can be quick and simple to overcome resistance, just issuing a threat and leaving it up to employees to decide where they go from there. But of course, this can cause more resistance. You can get employees complaining. You can damage your corporate culture because employees may resent leaders and overall businesses for using this strategy. They may choose to leave. So yes, you may threaten them with demotion or dismissal, but some employees may decide that that's what they're going to do, and the business may be losing people who are really valuable staff members as a result of that decision. Another thing that you need to know as part of this unit is the role of consultants and professional services. So we'll have a look at each of these and discuss how they're different, because this is something that you'll need to know as well. So consultants are external professionals hired by a business to offer advice on particular issues that are within the business. and they usually analyze the business's efficiency and effectiveness and then provide those recommendations. So, in this post maturity stage, businesses may get consultants to help identify strategies to minimize expenses, strategies to regain market share and renew their business, expansion opportunities as well. If the business is doing better and they want to expand to continue to grow, then a consultant may help them and guide them in that process. On the other hand, professional services providers are specialists in their field. They offer external expertise to businesses. So the difference here is, unlike consultants, professional services providers are like legally accountable for their work-related activities, because of their expertise and the nature of the knowledge that they're providing. So a consultant, they're just consulting the business. They're just an external party that is guiding the business, and it's not so sort of legally accountable and binding. Whereas for professional services, you've got people like lawyers, accountants, doctors, engineers, and architects. So if you think about lawyers, they have a lot of training, and um, they need to be providing professional services that are accurate and not misleading organizations. So they're accountable for the service that they're providing. Of course, doctors as well, when it comes to health, we often see um, things like inquiries into health systems, and doctors who may or may not have done something wrong in a professional kind of context, issuing the wrong medication, not looking closely enough at a patient who had an issue. So this is where those professional services that those people are providing are are about accountability, because they have got that specialty in the field, and they're providing that knowledge to a business um, for that reason. Okay, next up we've got strategic planning and vision for change. So in this case, you need to be able to explain what these things are and the relationship between them. So a vision for change is the position that a business hopes to be in after a change has been introduced. So they're thinking about the future, and they're envisaging what will the result be of that change. So it communicates why the change should occur and what the change should result in. Then a strategic plan, on the other hand, is a strategy that a business develops to detail how the change will be implemented. And so strategic planning usually happens after the vision for change has been formed. You need to have an idea of where you want to be, why you want to be there, and then you work on your strategy for actually achieving those goals. So you think about, how will the change be executed? What strategies will be used? So the relationship we can see here between these two things is that both the vision for change and the strategic planning are working together, um, and are part of that process that leads to the change, and hopefully a successful change for the business. So we mentioned Kurt Lewin earlier, and so we looked at the force field analysis. Another theory or model that you need to know that's from Kurt Lewin is the three-step model of change. So this has the steps of unfreeze, change, and refreeze. So you can think here about having ice. In order to change something, you need to unfreeze the business. You need to prepare for the change um, by sort of allowing some flexibility in the organization, ensuring that stakeholders understand why the change is necessary. Then, when you're in that middle stage, you're in that liquefied form where you're able to make all the changes easily. Um, so, businesses are going to implement the change and continue to engage in communication with stakeholders to make sure they're fully supportive and up to date with what's happening. And then once all of those changes have been made, you need to re-solidify the business and the way it operates. So solidifying, sustaining, and celebrating the change is that refreeze phase. So that's going to promote that sense of regained stability in the business. And it's also about proving, showing to employees how successful the change has been, and um, and celebrating them and their role in helping make that change happen. Something that is similar but a little bit more detailed is Kotter's theory, an 8-step model of change. So this is something that you need to work on trying to remember. So this model is about helping businesses execute change successfully by providing that framework for them to follow for a successful change. So it's about making sure that employees are participating in and accepting the change. So we've got 3 broader phases, and then within each phase, we've got a couple of steps, either 2 or 3 steps in each. So the first part is about creating a climate for change. So first of all, we have step 1, creating a sense of urgency. You need to show stakeholders why the change is necessary and why it needs to happen now. Then it's about forming that powerful coalition. So a coalition here is just meaning a team of people who are behind the change, who have authority in the organization and are going to help make that change happen. Then we've got that idea of a vision for change that we just discussed, establishing that set of strategies and that vision of where the business will be as a result of the change. And once you've got that climate for change, those base things in place, you then look at engaging and enabling the organization. So you need to communicate that vision that you've come up with to make sure that all stakeholders are aware of the change, are aware of what it would look like and how it will affect them. Then you want to empower those people who are involved. So remove any obstacles and empower others to follow the vision and champion what the business is hoping to achieve. Create quick wins. Now, this is about acknowledging and rewarding the people involved in the change. So it's important to make sure that that people know that they're valued and they're recognized for their role in helping an overall business. So that is where step 6 comes into play there. And lastly, we've got implementing the change. So building the change, you want to consolidate the changes that have been made, continue to strive for improvement and making it stick, ensuring stakeholders are aware of the success of the change. So it's proving that you've met your goals. At the start, you would have been looking at why the change should have happened, where you wanted to be. So at the end, you want to be reflecting back and thinking, did we achieve what we set out to achieve? How can we show people how successful we are? So there's different strategies that you can use for memorization. As you would be aware, there are lots of different things to memorize when it comes to year 12, and especially when you're preparing for your external exams. So having different tips and tricks up your sleeve to help you is really valuable. So you can have different memorization strategies like acronyms, rhymes, songs, little things like that to help you remember the steps for that Cotter's model that we just looked at. So a bit of an example, we've got the 8 steps and an acronym to represent that. So customers forming close connections excites clever business managers. And each of the first letters of those words is the first letter of the step for for that section of the model. There are lots of different approaches you can take and lots of different acronyms that you can come up with that you prefer. But that's just an example because hopefully knowing that first word, like empower, maybe you know that that's the E, you know that that is the 5th step in the process, and you can think what comes after empower, and you can think that that's probably an action thing, empowering action. So when it comes to analytical tools, so we've looked at the models, but like you will have done throughout your business studies so far, you also need to be able to use your analytical tools for your external exam. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these might be familiar to you and some of them may be new. So this slide is outlining our syllabus requirements. You need to be able to select data and information relating to the stakeholders of a business in the post-maturity stage to analyze the power and interest they have. So with that, you would be using a power interest grid. And we'll have a look at each of these analytical tools shortly. Another thing you may need to do is select data and information relating to a business that has undertaken change management and analyze the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's your SWOT analysis. You may need to use and look at the drivers of change using a SWOT analysis as well. And in terms of the force field analysis, you may need to use that to look at the pressures for or against change in a business that's in the post-maturity stage. Not only do you have to select data and information, but you also need to be able to interpret relationships and analyze things. So the stakeholder power interest grid, you can look at that to draw conclusions about the implications of transformation. The SWOT analysis, drawing conclusions about the implications of change management on financial, human resources, marketing, and operations. They're your 4 key business functions. And then the force field analysis can help you draw conclusions about the overall implications of transformation for the business. So let's have a look now at an example force field analysis. So we went through this earlier to explain the general idea behind this. So it's a common change management approach used to help implement change. The idea behind this is situations are maintained by an equilibrium or a balance between driving and restraining forces. So driving forces need to be strengthened or restraining forces need to be weakened for the situation to shift and the change to occur successfully. So this change management technique is all about maximizing the likelihood that the change will be successful because you're helping the business to identify any obstacles, and before implementing the change, actually manage and reduce those issues. So when the change is implemented, those issues don't exist anymore. So our example here is Avon, and we'll get to that shortly. But first of all, let's just do a refresher of the different steps that are involved. So determining the change, then brainstorming the driving and restraining forces. So the change is what you put in the middle section of your force field analysis. And then the driving and restraining forces are what you put on either side, in the sort of arrows that are moving towards the change. They're having an impact on the change. That's what the arrows are representing. Next, in step 4, you're evaluating those driving and restraining forces that you've come up with. And you're doing that by assigning the scores from 1 to 5, depending on how influential those forces are. Then you're creating a strategy to strengthen the driving forces or weaken the restraining forces, and then creating a list of steps to achieve that desired outcome, to implement that strategy you've come up with. So this Avon example that we've got here shows that the driving forces outweigh the restraining forces. So the change example we've got here is Avon changing its business model by discontinuing door-to-door sales in favor of online sales methods. So some driving forces, for example, we've got the need to have an online presence to remain competitive. So competition is a huge driver of change in this example, because while Avon was successful back in its time using that door-to-door method, because changes happened in society, that no longer was going to be sustainable, and it wasn't keeping up with competition. So a common sort of thing from back when this first started was that women didn't work as much as they do now, and often women used to be stay-at-home mums and things like that, and would be able to answer the door for an Avon sales representative. But now in today's society, we have more equality between men and women, more women in the workforce, and so that is going to mean that that door-to-door method won't be so effective. We've got consumer demand for e-commerce and convenience. They want to be able to buy things when they want them, rather than relying on sales representatives coming to their door. We've got the idea that just being approached by a stranger at your door is maybe not something that we value so much in society today. A lot of people would be uncomfortable with that. Safety considerations and those sorts of things as well. Another driving force is just the expenses. Having transport and that idea of a physical person going somewhere to get sales would be expensive, and having just an online store would be far more cost effective. But then on the other hand, there are restraining forces as well. You do need technology to help make that change happen, and so there is a cost to implement that technology. Losing the point of difference, Avon was different because of its door-to-door method. So the business would need to think about how to position itself as being unique in the market to continue to attract people. Sales representatives would be redundant as a result of this change, and that's something that the business would need to consider and manage to make sure that it has good relationships still with existing employees, people who are going to continue to work in the business, and also those who are leaving the organization. Lots of close relationships as well between Avon and customers. So Avon was able to form those close connections because of working face to face with people in that physical environment, and they would lose that as a result of this change. So you can see here that we've assigned different numbers to represent the influence of each force. And be aware that this isn't something that's going to be a matter of right and wrong. So I've assigned these different ones different numbers, but you may choose something slightly different. So the cost of implementing new technologies, you may think that that's a bit more influential and give it a 2 or a 3. You may think that the sales representatives being redundant is less influential and only should be a 3 or a 2. Basically, what you decide just needs to be reasonable and justifiable. So just give it some thought and be logical in the scores that you give. So based on this analysis, Avon would be able to formulate some strategies to ensure that it successfully implements this change. So we can see here that the driving forces are outweighing the restraining forces, which suggests that it is a good change to implement, and the business just needs to figure out the best way to approach it. So they may try to further weaken the restraining forces before moving forward. So maybe it will try and establish a new point of difference and try and think about how to offer sales representatives new roles in the business so it can keep that corporate culture alive. The power interest grid is another one you need to know. Again, this is something that you can have differences in the way that you use your scores here, the way that you position different people in this grid. So the power interest grid is about looking at the power and the interest of stakeholders and then plotting it on a bit of a graph. So anyone who is involved in a project is going to need to be on the grid. So you are looking at the y-axis, or the vertical axis is about the power, and the x-axis or the horizontal axis is about the level of interest. And you've got 4 sections in the graph. Each of those is representing the different degree of power and interest that those people have. So monitor is the lowest section down in the bottom left. We'll see an example on the next slide shortly. And this is low power and low interest. So you just need to monitor the people in that section because they don't have a lot of power over the decision making. They don't have too much interest, but they are still a stakeholder. And their level of power and interest can change. That's why, even though they are low at the moment, they could have greater interest at some stage during the process, or increase in power. And that means that you need to keep an eye on them in case those changes happen. Keep informed is about people with low power but high interest. So different sort of external lobbying groups and things like that are passionate about issues may not have a lot of power, but they definitely have a lot of interest. Keeping satisfied is for the high power and the low interest. And manage closely is the one that matters most, where you've got high power people who also have high interest in the project or the change that you're looking at. So an example is General Motors, the car company. So by 2035, General Motors said that they wanted to manufacture only electric cars and become carbon neutral by 2040. So the business needs to determine the power and interest of stakeholders to make sure that this project is successful. Now, step 1 is identifying stakeholders. You think of everyone who is affected by or involved in this process and brainstorm them and list them down. Then you are plotting those stakeholders on your grid. So this is what the grid looks like with those 4 categories we just looked at. And like I mentioned, where you plot the people or the stakeholders um, is up to you, and it's just about being logical. So you may think that employees should be a centimeter higher and a centimeter further to the right, putting them in the border between monitor and keep informed. And that's okay. As long as you have a justification for that, that is perfectly fine. What you would want to avoid is just choosing something that just doesn't make any sense. So, the CEO of any company is going to have a lot of power and a great deal of interest in the success of any project. So, the CEO is not going to be in the monitor section logically. The SWOT analysis is something that a lot of you will probably be familiar with already. You've got your internal strengths and weaknesses, and you've got your external opportunities and threats that you're looking at with this grid, this table that you do up for the SWOT analysis. So, the strengths: what does the business do well? What advantages does it have over its competitors? The weaknesses are just the opposite. What does it lack or do poorly? What disadvantages does the business have? Opportunities: where can the business go? What opportunities exist for expansion or investment? Is there increasing demand for services or products that the business can tap into? And then threats. This usually revolves around competitors, but it can also be about the business environment and what's happening there. So those macro environmental factors that can influence a business. For your evaluation criteria, these are the same evaluation criteria that you will have been looking at throughout your business studies. So you've got your 4 categories: competitiveness, stakeholder satisfaction, effectiveness, and efficiency. According to the syllabus, you have to evaluate, you may have to evaluate any of these different things. So staying on top of all of them is important because you don't know what will be on your exam. Financial management strategies for transforming a business, human resources strategies, marketing strategies, or operations management strategies. So those 4 pillars with your 4 key kind of areas that you look at in business, those could all come up in your external exam. So let's go through your evaluation criteria. Competitiveness is about the degree that the business has offered products or services that meet or exceed market standards in relation to other businesses. So you can compare different businesses to think about the level of competitiveness. You can look at measures like market share, resources, growth, profit, any expansion intentions. All of those things can be factored into competitiveness. Stakeholder satisfaction is about the level that the business has considered and managed stakeholder expectations in achieving goals and objectives. Now, these definitions that we've got here are all from the syllabus. I recommend you go to the syllabus to have a look at the glossary if there's any terms that you aren't sure about. Now, stakeholders can include a wide range of people. It's a really broad term. So you could be looking at customers, employees, investors, suppliers, or management. And again, lots of different factors can be looked at to think about satisfaction, growth, employee retention, loyalty, and funding from investors, for example. Effectiveness and efficiency. Now, this is something that you can get a bit confused, but effectiveness is about the degree that the business has achieved goals and to what extent the business has solved any targeted problems. So it can be applied to any business strategy. This is always a really good one that's versatile. So effectiveness is about doing the right thing. And then efficiency is about doing that thing right. So optimizing the use of resources and processes to achieve the goal in a really efficient way. So this is about the time and the effort and the money that is required for a change or a strategy to occur. So lastly, some tips for you to take away for your external exam and the rest of your studies. So make sure that you know real world business examples to demonstrate the concepts that you are learning in business, not just the definitions themselves. Because when it comes to your external exam, you're often going to be asked to think about examples of things as well. And having those examples in mind is really important when you're asked to explain something, because it shows that you can provide that extra little something um, to demonstrate a concept. So I recommend using the syllabus as a study guide. Anything that is not in the syllabus can't be covered in the exam or in any of your assessment pieces. Anything that is in the syllabus may be covered. So using that as a study guide is something that's pretty foolproof. So you can scan the top QR code there to access the syllabus, or also just go to the QCEE website as well. Now, if you finish your external exam early, make sure you use your extra time wisely. So reread as much of the exam as you can. Try and improve your vocabulary. Look at your grammar and your spelling to make sure it's all as polished as you can make it. Make sure you use business terminology. So you might like to create a word bank to help you remember important business terms. You can find all your important business terms in the resources that you have in class, in your textbooks, and in slides like this deck of slides. And make sure you also access previous external exams on the QCEE website. So you can see those exams, access them by scanning that QR code on the bottom there. You might like to print them out and do them in exam conditions to try and prepare yourself for what the real exam will feel like as well. Thank you everyone for coming along to our business lecture today. I hope that it has been effective for you, and I hope that you have a good rest of your year. Thank you for coming along, and I hope to see you next time. Bye everyone.